strain. Was it a bicycle? What is wrong with my brain? Is it the end of me? No, I must still believe. So I'm still alive, you see. Heck yeah, now I'm on my way. But let's stay focused, there's still a job in hand that we must do. Cameras start to click, we know what create is something new. So go Marty and Sarah and Mark and Matt, Owen, Smitty, McGrilly and Jamie Lane in the Archer County Band. The Archer County Band. The Archer County Band. The Archer County Band. Stop the clock, we're done, we're rolling. Sound the horn and sing that we are going. 27 hours, that is the time. So let's hop on the bus and let it shine, 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 shine. Say sha la 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 la, 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 sha la 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 la. Good evening, folks. You are very welcome to Bandito Talks, live here on YouTube, 8 p.m. I put particular emphasis on the 8 p.m. I will explain that in a moment, but you are very welcome to Bandito Talks. We are live here on YouTube. It is Friday evening. It is our first live stream of the weekend. We have had to work for this live stream this evening. Boy, we have had to work. Of course, for all of the more frequent viewers of Bandito Talks, you will perhaps be wondering, why is the Bandito live at 8 p.m? Because normally the way we roll here on Bandito Talks is every Friday, every Saturday, and every Sunday, we are live here on YouTube at 7 p.m. But oh no, tonight, we decide to come on live at 8 p.m. A full 60 minutes late. But this is the thing. We talked last week about gremlins invading our live streams. Of course, last Saturday, we had a gremlin, a technological gremlin, invaded our live stream last Saturday, right in the middle of the stream, just as we were getting right into Nancy Pelosi and, of course, Reform UK. All of that. We had a gremlin come right into our stream. And what the gremlin did was it caused the audio and the visuals to go out of sync. What happened this evening, of course? Well, I come on at 7 p.m. As always, 7 p.m, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, we are always live here on YouTube. So I come on at 7 p.m, a full 60 minutes ago. And what happens? I find out that our first live stream of the week has been invaded by a gremlin. A gremlin was in the stream once again. So, of course, I have spent the last 60 minutes trying to find out how this gremlin was doing its dirty work. And I think I've got to the bottom of it. I do believe that I am live. I do believe that I am in sync. So it's been a bit of a interesting, I suppose we could say. The last 60 minutes have been interesting. I've learned some things about streaming live. I thought I had become the master of streaming live. Of course, we've been doing this now for the last 4 weeks or so, and I thought I had learned everything there was to know about live streaming. But oh no, Friday night was to surprise the Bandito. We had a gremlin right in the stream from the get-go. So anyway, that is the long-arsed explanation as to why we are 60 minutes late tonight. But we've made it. And we've got a good show lined up, even though we are late. So before we get into all things Bandito Talks, it is of course Friday evening, which can mean only one thing. It is our Let's Reflect segment. Every Friday, we have a little segment here on Bandito Talks that we call Let's Reflect. And what do we do on our Friday evening Let's Reflect segment? Well, what we do is we dive a little deeper into our Tuesday upload. So, of course, we had a Tuesday upload this week. Sometimes it can be a guest. Sometimes it is a best bits compilation. This Tuesday's episode was a best bits compilation. So what we're going to be doing tonight is diving into Tuesday's upload, getting in under the surface a little bit more, diving a little deeper, seeing what further lessons we can extract from Tuesday's upload. Now, of course, for those of you who've been following the show across the week, you will have realised that our best bits upload on Tuesday, and indeed all of our YouTube shorts that have been coming this week, you will perhaps have noticed that the quantity of highlights and clips have increased significantly. It just turns out that we had a lot to talk about on last week's shows. So Friday, Saturday and Sunday last week, we had our 3 live streams. And we had a lot of clips to take out. So there were a lot of clips and highlights that went into our best bits upload on Tuesday, and of course that we've been uploading throughout the week via YouTube shorts. Now, we're not going to go into all of those highlights or all of those clips. There are a few ones specifically that are going to relate to tonight's show. So that should be good. But of course, before we get into the main bulk of tonight's content, if you enjoy our Friday night segment here on Bandito Talks, Let's Reflect. If you like what we do on this little segment, then feel free to like the live stream. Give it a little thumbs up here on YouTube. If you are joining us live here on YouTube at 8 p.m, 8 p.m. of course. If you're joining us live at 8 p.m. because of the gremlin that tried to sabotage us at 7 p.m, but it wasn't successful. So if you're joining us live, get into the live chat. We had lots of engagement last week on a number of our shows. Lots of engagement. It always makes things a little more fun when we have engagement here on Bandito Talks. So get into the live chat. Drop me your thoughts, your comments, your queries, your questions, whatever it may be. And of course, if you're watching the live stream after the event itself, after the live has been posted, which of course we can do these days, which is terrific. But if you're watching the live stream after it has been posted, get down into the comments section, let me know your thoughts and feelings with respect to the show. And finally, if you enjoy what we do here on Bandito Talks, if you think there is value, if you think it is interesting, if you think it is insightful, any of those words, if you like what we do, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. As I've already said, every Friday, every Saturday and every Sunday, we are normally live at 7 p.m. So you will always have 3 live shows every week, and then we'll have our Tuesday upload. It could be a guest, it could be a best bits upload, whatever it may be, and we'll have all of those YouTube shorts coming throughout the week. So plenty of content coming your direction if you become a subscriber to the Bandito Talks channel. With all of that said, let's dive into tonight's show. First things first, I want to make sure that I am actually live. I want to make sure that I'm live and that there are no gremlins. So let's have a wee check here with the live chat. I want to make sure that before I keep going, that everything has been resolved. So let's have a look in the live chat. We do, of course, have one commenter in the live chat. It is Quizzed, our faithful commenter, our faithful follower, our faithful subscriber. Quizzed has been there from the beginning of Bandito Talks. Let's see if Quizzed is going to tell me if I'm in sync or not. Quizzed says the following. He pulled it off, defeated the gremlin. By endurance, we conquer. That's what I want to hear, Quizzed. We have defeated the gremlin. And I've just got a message through as well. One of my friends who sometimes will tune into the show has also sent me a message saying, looks good, gremlin defeated by the Bandito. That is how we rock here, folks, on Bandito Talks. I was thinking about giving in. It crossed my mind. The thought flickered across my consciousness. I thought, maybe I'll give in. Oh, it's 8 o'clock. I'm 1 whole hour behind schedule. It came across my mind to do that. And then you know what I thought? I'm not having no gremlin ruin Friday evening's Let's Reflect live stream. We can't have that. That is not going to disrupt our plans. It's the first live stream of the week here on Bandito Talks. We are going to, by hook or by crook, make this work. Thank you, Quizzed, for getting into the live chat and letting me know that everything is functioning as it should be functioning. And of course, to my unnamed friend who has sent me a message to let me know that everything is working as it should be and that the gremlin has been defeated. There's nothing that gives the Bandito more satisfaction than defeating an invading gremlin. Nothing gives me more satisfaction. The gremlin tried and the gremlin failed. And with that, folks, let's get into tonight's show. Okay, so let's just set the scene. Let's set the scene so that our discussion is going to make sense going through the next 60 odd minutes. So, it is of course Friday, which means it is a Let's Reflect episode. So we're going to be reflecting on Tuesday's upload. That much is already clear. Now, as I've already said, there were a lot of clips and highlights from our Tuesday upload, our best bits compilation. So the question is, what of all of those clips that we had in our Tuesday upload, which of those are most relevant to tonight's show? Well, I think the clips that were most interesting to me, and I think the clips that are most topical, were with respect to the BBC. And of course, it's been a hot topic in the news. It's been a hot topic in the news that the BBC, as we talked about in a couple of last week's show, or maybe it was, I think it was on episode 13, we talked about the BBC. And the BBC, just to do a little bit of a recap, for those of you who may not be familiar what I'm referring to. So it turns out that there's been a bit of a scandal at the BBC. A bit of a scandal, and the scandal revolves around a panorama documentary, I am led to believe. So a panorama documentary that the BBC put together. And what happened was, the BBC did some deceptive editing of a Donald Trump speech in this panorama documentary. Now, what do I mean by that? So let's just recap a little bit here what happened. What happened was, the BBC took the first part of the Donald Trump speech and the last part of this same Donald Trump speech. And what the BBC did was, they took a clip from the beginning of the speech, and then 50 minutes later, in the same speech, the BBC took another clip 50 minutes later, pasted both of those clips together, and tried to make it out as if those pasted together clips were all part of the same segment of the speech. Now, of course, you may be thinking, why is this relevant? Well, if you actually watch the clip, and I would encourage you to do so, I would encourage you after the live stream to go and look at the panorama edited version of the Donald Trump speech and then the original version of the Donald Trump speech. Now, this speech took place, I believe it was in I think it was the second time Donald Trump tried to run for office. So I think it was maybe 2021. It was something like that. 2021. So Donald Trump gave a speech. I think it was on January the 6th, 2021. And it was his attempt, essentially, to get back into office a second time. Now, as we know, he ended up losing that presidential election to Joe Biden. But he was still trying to make his case for being president once again for a second consecutive term. Now, during this speech on January the 6th in 2021, what happened was the BBC, when they were covering this speech in their Panorama documentary, as I've said, they took a clip from the beginning of the speech, a clip from the end of the speech, 50 minutes later, pasted them together and tried to make it out as if this pasted together section of two clips that were separated by 50 minutes worth of speaking were actually taking place in the one moment. Now, why is this relevant, and how is it relevant to tonight's show? Well, of course, the BBC has been embroiled in this scandal now because, of course, what has happened? Welcome to the internet. People have, of course, found out that the BBC deceptively edited this speech. And why is it such a big deal? It's a big deal because when you see the deceptively edited version of Donald Trump's speech, what it portrays Donald Trump as saying is that he was inciting violence. Essentially, that's what's happened. Because, of course, on January the 6th, 2021, there were these big riots at the White House where Donald Trump's supporters engaged in this, it seemed to be a violent protest. That's how it was portrayed in the media. And this part of Donald Trump's speech that the Panorama documentary aired to millions of people, this deceptively edited part of the speech made it out as if Donald Trump was inciting violence. In other words, this deceptively edited speech was portrayed to the public as Donald Trump telling his supporters to descend upon the White House and engage in some sort of a violent protest. When you look at the deceptively edited clip, that is the conclusion that you could perhaps draw. If you were a viewer of this Panorama documentary from the BBC, you would view this edited clip by the BBC of Donald Trump's speech in 2021. You would view it as Donald Trump inciting violence. You would think it could cross your mind that Donald Trump was basically about to lose the election and he was basically telling his supporters, no, descend upon Washington and engage in a violent protest. That's what it looks like when you look at the edited version of the speech from the BBC. Now, of course, when you look at the original speech, and this is what's happened, and this is why it's a big scandal, because the BBC, as we talked about last week, have been caught with their underpants hanging out with their socks. What happens when your underpants are hanging out with your socks? That means that your underpants aren't where they are supposed to be. In other words, you are in the buff. And the BBC currently are in the buff. They've been caught out in the nip. Okay? And how has this happened? Well, of course, the original clip and the original speech has now been set side by side with the deceptively edited version, and people can now clearly see what has happened. What has happened is the BBC, for whatever reason we could speculate why the BBC have decided to do this, but for whatever their reasoning is, the BBC decided to paste together two completely separate points in Donald Trump's speech, and they pasted them together, and it gave the illusion that Donald Trump was inciting violence, was telling his supporters to descend upon Washington and engage in a violent protest. Of course, when you watch the original clip, you can clearly see that the 2 points that were pasted together happen 50 minutes apart in the speech. So as a result, it is a complete misrepresentation of what Donald Trump actually said. It is completely inaccurate. Okay, so why am I saying all this? Well, the reason why I'm saying all this, and you may have seen it in the description of tonight's live stream, we now live in the information age. We live in the information age. We do not any longer live in an age whereby the only way you can get information is through a book at the library, through your teacher, through your professor, or through your parents. That used to be kind of the way you used to acquire information. You would go to the library, you would read a book, you would ask your parents, you would ask your teacher, you would ask your professor, something like that. In other words, back in the day, those were the main ways in which you could acquire information. I could maybe throw in friends as well. But basically, you had to acquire all of your information in the real world. You had to go and get a physical book that had been written by someone or typed up by someone. You had to physically meet with your parents to get an exchange of information. You had to meet with a teacher, a professor, a friend. Everything happened in the real world. Of course, now we live in the information age. So not only can you get your information from books in libraries, not only can you get information from parents, teachers, professors, friends, but you can also go on to this thing that we call the internet. You can go on to these things called social media. And so as a result, information has never been more accessible than right now. We have access to an enormous amount of information. Information is coming at us from all angles. And this is essentially possible through the online space, the internet and social media. So the landscape for acquiring information has changed dramatically. There has been a dramatic change in the way in which we can acquire information because we no longer need to be in the physical world to acquire information. We can simply go online using our laptop, using our phones, using our tablets. We can use all of these things to acquire information in this space that we call the online sphere, the digital space. Now, one would think that this is a great thing because somebody might say, well, now you have access to all of the information or a whole bunch of information on the internet, on social media. Isn't this not a great thing? You have access, easy access. Not just access, you have easy access to lots of information. Shouldn't this make your life better? Well, you see, this is the thing. It is true. We do have access to a whole bunch of information via the internet, via social media. That is true. These are game changers in terms of our ability to acquire information. But we are left with an interesting dilemma. I'm saying dilemma. What is the dilemma? Well, we have all of this information. That is true. But you see, there's a difference between high quality, accurate, factually correct, and valuable information and shitty, bogus, deceptive information. And this is the thing. When we go on to the online sphere, we are bombarded with a whole bunch of information. Everybody's giving their 10 cents worth about how the world works, what is factually correct. And so you're left with this sort of dilemma. And the dilemma is, who is correct? How do I know that person X is correct and has more accurate information in comparison with person Y? This is the dilemma. Yes, we live in the information age. That is true. However, what we must do is we must figure out a way to decipher what information is valuable and accurate and representative of the facts of reality, and what information is bogus, shitty, and deceptive. So this brings in our BBC article. And not even our BBC article that we read on last week's show, just this general scandal with the BBC. This is an example, folks, of the BBC exists now in the online sphere. along with many other media outlets, many other commentators, many other people, the BBC exists in this online soup of information. And what have we seen? What have we witnessed over the last week or so as this scandal about the deceptive editing of Donald Trump's speech has broken loose into the public sphere? Well, of course, it brings into question the credibility of the BBC as a news outlet. How could it not? Our mate, Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, he resigned in light of the scandal. Heads are rolling. Of course, if Tim Davie was watching Bandito Talks last week, he will have realised that I had an open invitation to Tim Davie. He may be unemployed now, but of course he's a Director General of the BBC. He's free to join Bandito Talks. Well, he's not free to join. He's not free. Let me define what I'm saying to Tim Davie if he's tuning in on Friday evening. If he's tuning in tonight. Tim, as I said last week, if you're interested in joining me and my massive team here at Bandito Talks, drop me your CV and I'll consider it. Point being, Tim Davie has resigned, the Director General of the BBC, over this scandal. And of course, the public are now looking at the BBC as a news outlet. A news outlet, I'm going to emphasise that, a news outlet. Of course, a news outlet is supposed to provide accurate, up-to-date information that is representative of the facts of reality. Now, this scandal with Donald Trump, and again, I would encourage you to go and watch. There are plenty of videos up online showing the deceptively edited version of Donald Trump's speech from the BBC, and then the original version. And if you watch the two side by side, you will immediately say to yourself, whoa, that is very deceptive editing. It's so deceptive that when you watch the altered, deceptively edited version, you genuinely would think that Donald Trump was telling his supporters to storm Washington and engage in some sort of a violent protest. That is what you would think, and you could not blame someone who was taking that, I suppose we could say, panorama documentary at face value. You couldn't, in a sense, blame someone for thinking that initially when you would see that altered version of his speech. But of course, when you see it side by side with the original, you very quickly realise, oh my goodness, the panorama, the BBC, have taken a segment from the beginning of the speech, a segment 50 minutes later at the end of the speech, pasted them together and tried to give you the impression that Donald Trump was saying that all in one flowing speech, all in one flowing movement, we could say. Which of course is not representative of reality. Donald Trump did not say those things in that order. They've been pasted together. So, this is the thing. We live in the information age, but this article and this scandal with the BBC highlights a very important question for all of us. Yes, we live in the information age. Yes, we have access to copious amounts of media articles and videos and opinions from commentators and YouTubers and live streamers and political commentators, you name it. We have access to so much information. But this scandal with the BBC raises this very important question, which is, yes, we have access to a whole bunch of information, but how do we know what information is valuable, factually correct, representative of reality, and what information is bogus garbage? So that's the question. And that's a question that we're going to deal with tonight on our show. We're going to look at a two-step process for trying to essentially deal with the bombardment of information that we have now in the information age. Because everybody has laptops, tablets, phones. We all have these things. We cannot really escape them. You can try to escape them. Some people do. Some people say, I'm fed up with the online sphere. I'm fed up with the internet age. I'm fed up with this bombardment of information. But for most of us, it is a reality. We are bombarded by information. And this is the thing. If you know how to approach the internet age, if you know how to approach the information age in which we live, you can use all of this to your benefit. This is what we do here on Bandito Talks. How can we extract the lessons out of a whole variety of things? Well, what are the lessons we can extract from the internet age? What lessons can we extract from this BBC scandal? That's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to delve into this two-step process for assessing information, for trying to figure out a way for how to deal with information, all of this information that we are bombarded with, and how we can try and figure out how can we tease apart the shit information from the valuable, factually correct information that is a true representation of reality. Now, before we get into this two-step process, you may be thinking, why has he called tonight's episode 14? Why has he called episode 14, Wait, It's a False Widow? ? What has this got to do with anything that I have just talked about? Well, let's get a few things clear first. When you see a false widow in our title of tonight's stream, no, I am not talking about someone who has faked their husband's death and they're a false widow. Not that type of widow. Oh no, we're talking false widow spiders. We're talking spiders. The false widow spider. Now I can already perhaps imagine rolling eyes. Why is he talking about false widow spiders? Well, it's related to everything that we've talked about so far. Let me explain, and then we'll get into this two-step process for dealing with the age of information, the information age. So how are false widows related to tonight's show and to everything that we've already talked about? Okay. Now, before I get into this, I want to declare and make it very clear. I am not an expert in spiders. I am not what is the official term for a spider expert? An arachnologist? I don't know. Let's look it up. Let me see. What is the official term for an expert in spider behavior or an expert for spiders in general? Let's have a look and see. Now, I think everything's going fine here with the stream. I don't think anything has went tits up since I've started. I think everything's fine. So let's keep going. So let's see. What are spider experts called? Let's get this right. I am correct. A spider expert is called an arachnologist. Arachnologist. There we go. Okay. So with that little detail verified, I want to again make it clear I am not an arachnologist, if that is how you pronounce it. I hope that's how you pronounce it. I am not an arachnologist. I'm not an expert in spiders or their behavior, but I know a little bit about them. I know enough to make it relatable to tonight's show. So what am I talking about? What's this business of false widow spiders? Okay, so for those of you who are into your spiders, you maybe have heard of the false widow. So what is the false widow? The false widow is a type of spider that looks similar to a black widow spider. Now, those of you who are familiar with black widow spiders, and I think a lot of people are familiar with black widow spiders. I think black widow spiders have a fearsome reputation among most of humanity. And if you're not a fan of spiders like me, now I don't have a beef with spiders. Spiders form a very important part of our ecosystems, of our food chain. They act as prey for certain creatures and then they perform the function of a predator for other animals. So they're very important. I wouldn't want to extinguish spiders from the world's existence because that would cause a cascading fiasco within our ecosystems and our food chains and in our natural environments in general. So I wouldn't want to get rid of spiders, but I'm not a fan of them. They creep me out. But the black widow spider, even for the biggest fan, we could argue, of spiders on the planet, even the biggest fan would have a tremendous respect and caution when it would come to dealing with the black widow spider, because we've always heard of black widows and their toxic venom. If you get bitten by a black widow, you're in a little bit of trouble. You're in quite a bit of trouble. You are in danger. Your life is in danger if you get bitten by a black widow, because its venom is toxic. I can't remember what the name of its toxic venom is, but all we need to know is that if you get bitten by a black widow, you are in trouble. You're in danger. Your life is in danger. So, this is the interesting thing. The false widow spider looks very similar to the black widow spider, but there's a big difference. The false widow spider does not have a dangerous toxic venom. So if you are bitten by a false widow spider, you may get a little bit of inflammation. It may be a little bit painful. The skin may go a little bit red, but there is no toxic effect from the venom of a false widow spider. Contrast that with a bite from a black widow. Very toxic venom, very dangerous, a threat to your life. So I think we would all agree that when it comes to an analysis of widow spiders, okay, if you live in a part of the world that is renowned for having black widow spiders and false widow spiders, okay, so if you live in a part of the world where both species are commonly found, let's imagine you go down the stairs in the morning, you go to put your shoes on, but you notice that there's a web in your shoes. Now, I think we would agree that if you live in a part of the world where there are both false widow spiders, which have a non-toxic venom and they're not dangerous to humans, and black widow spiders, which have a very toxic venom and are dangerous to humans, if you live in a part of the world where both spiders exist, when you look into your shoe with the spider web present, you are going to want to know, am I dealing with a false widow or am I dealing with a black widow? Because depending on which spider is in your shoe, it is going to cause you to approach this situation in a different manner. If you know that it's only a false widow, then you're going to be thinking, okay, I'm not a big fan of spiders. Say, for example, say you're not a big fan of spiders. You'll approach your shoe and say, okay, it's a false widow, so I know it's not dangerous to my life, so as a result, I'm going to proceed to remove this spider this way. Now, what happens if it's actually a black widow? That's going to change, I would argue, your approach to this situation. You're going to approach this situation with a tremendous amount more of caution, anxiety, trepidation, whatever word we want to use, because you acknowledge, oh, this isn't a false widow, this is a black widow. And if I don't get my shit together, and if I don't actually deal with the removal of this spider from my shoe and my house in the correct way, I could get bitten and I could be in a lot of trouble. So it automatically changes the situation depending on your ability to identify which spider is in your shoe. So the key here, folks, lies in the ability to identify which spider is in your shoe. I think we would agree that that is important. So, how is this related to what I'm talking about? Well, when we are basked in the online sphere, we are bombarded with shitty, bogus, deceptive information, and we are also bombarded with useful, valuable information that is representative of the facts of reality. We will want to know which information we have on our hands, just in the same way as we will want to know which type of spider is in our shoe. Is it a false widow or is it a black widow? It's the same thing. When you're dealing with information, you want to know what is the shitty, deceptive, dangerous information and what is the useful, accurate, reliable information. Because, folks, if you are ingesting a whole bunch of shitty, bogus, deceptive, nonsense information, why is that the equivalent danger to having a black widow in your shoe? Why is it equivalent? Well, if you are ingesting shit information that is not accurate and doesn't represent reality, what is going to happen? You are going to be ingesting factually incorrect information, which is going to lead to more distortion in your worldview. What happens when you have more distortion in your worldview? This leads to errors in your decision making. And what happens when you make more and more errors in your decision making? You end up damaging or negatively affecting your own existence. If you continue to make mistakes and errors in your existence as a result of increasing distortion coming from shitty, bogus information that you are ingesting day after day, you are going to have a greater probability of living a more negative life existence, an existence that is going to end up being damaged by your poor decision making. On the flip side, if you are taking in useful, valuable, factually correct information, this is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to help you clear distortion from your worldview and your perspective. And the more distortion that you can clear from your worldview, the more accurate your decision making becomes. And the more accurate your decision making becomes, the fewer errors you're going to make in your decisions day to day. And as a result, the probability of you living an existence that's more fulfilling is going to increase. Because the fewer distortions that you have, the more accurate your decision making will be. Whether that is in the business arena, in the friendship arena, in the romantic arena, whatever it is, if you have more accurate information, that accurate information has the effect of clearing distortion out of your worldview. The fewer distortions that you have, the fewer mistakes you have in terms of analyzing the functioning of the world. The more accurately you can understand the world and how it functions, the better your decision making will be. So this is the thing. If we have our shoe with a spider web, we are going to want to know, is that a false widow that's in our shoe, or is it a black widow? Because depending which type of spider is in our shoe, that is going to affect the nature of our decision about how to deal with this spider. Because if it is actually a black widow, then that means the closer we approach that shoe and the sloppier that we approach it, the sloppier our approach in general with dealing with that black widow, what could happen? We could end up getting bitten. If we get bitten, we are now in trouble. It is the same thing with information. If you are not able to correctly identify the right amount or the most accurate, the most representative information in the online sphere, remember, we live in the information age. So if you're trolling, if you're essentially using your phone on a daily basis or your laptop and you're watching news and you're listening to all the variety of commentators and people on the internet, then you need to be able to do the equivalent of distinguishing between a false widow and a black widow. In the informational sense, you need to understand, how can I tease apart shit information from accurate, valuable information? Because the better you're able to tease apart each of these things, the better it's going to be for your own worldview. Your own worldview, your own mind. Your own mind will be riddled with fewer distortions. Because that's the idea here, folks. Why do we even seek new information? Why do we even turn on the news? Why do we do this? Why do we seek information online? We seek information, and you may not realize it, but the reason why you are seeking information is because you are looking to clear distortion from your mind, clear distortion from your worldview. That's why people watch the news. They're trying to figure out what is the most up-to-date information that is happening in the world, so that whenever I'm making decisions about what I'm going to do in this life, they are the most accurate as possible, essentially. We want to be making decisions that are as accurate as possible, that are as distortion-free as possible. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's imagine you listen to a media outlet called, let's make up a name. Let's call it Sunglasses Media. Sunglasses Media. And Sunglasses Media specializes in telling you about all of the best spots to travel to on your holiday. In other words, Sunglasses Media is trying to inform the public about the best places at the best value where you can go on your holiday in order to get sunshine and a nice, enjoyable, warm climate where you can kick back and relax. So Sunglasses Media, they are going to be giving you information about the best places to go on your holiday in order to find a warm, sunny climate. Now, what happens if Sunglasses Media tells you, oh, it's actually a really good idea to go to, let's say it's a really good idea to go to Iran. It's a really good idea to go to Iran this summer because Iran has a nice sunny climate and you'll be able to enjoy the beautiful mountainous terrain of Iran. And let's say Sunglasses Media gives you the impression that Iran is this beautiful location, free from war, no conflict, people on the ground are going to welcome you with open arms, and there's going to be no conflict there whatsoever. You're going to have no issues with your safety. It's a great place to go right now on your holiday. So let's imagine you take Sunglasses Media at face value and say, you know what? I think we're going to go to Iran for a weekend break. Now, of course, it turns out that Sunglasses Media has been deceptive in its reporting of the current circumstances in Iran. For anybody who would have been getting their information from another source that's a little more accurate, that person would realize, of course, Iran isn't maybe the best place to be going on your holiday right now because they're kind of on the brink of conflict with other countries in the Middle East and potentially with the United States of America. So somebody else getting their information from another source would look at Iran and say, you know what, maybe at some stage in the future, but right now it appears that Iran is in a turbulent phase of its history. There seems to be a lot of acrimony, a lot of turbulence, let's just say, with its neighbours in the Middle East and with the United States. So if I'm going to choose a location to go and visit, I would rather choose somewhere else that's not potentially going to be engulfed in some sort of upcoming war, which is what could happen, some sort of conflict. So let's imagine now, that would be the perspective of someone who has been getting their information from another source. But if you are this person who's been glued to Sunglasses Media and you've now bought your plane ticket to head off to Iran, you are now operating under a distorted worldview. You are operating under the distorted illusion that Iran is actually a conflict-free zone, that it's going to be a beautiful mountainous area. You're not going to be walking into a war or anything like that. You're going to be welcomed in there and you're going to have a lovely, safe trip throughout Iran. If you're operating under that distorted illusion, you will head out to Iran. And what, of course, could happen? You could get caught up in a very nasty conflict, which then ends up putting your life in jeopardy. Now, a simple example it may be, but this is what happens whenever we operate in this world under distortion. The person who has been listening to Sunglasses Media in order to figure out where the best spot is to go on their weekend break for a quick holiday to somewhere where it's nice and warm, if that person is literally operating under the deceptive information of Sunglasses Media, that person has now ingested information that is deceptive. And that deceptively relayed information is going to create distortion in the mind and worldview of that individual who has consumed the media. And this distorted worldview will end up leading this person to traveling to Iran under the distorted illusion that it's safe, conflict-free, and not engulfed in some sort of a simmering conflict that is potentially going to come in the future. That person lands in Iran, and what could happen? Boom, they could get caught up in the middle of a conflict that has nothing to do with them, but now they're trapped in Iran, and God knows what could happen. Because when you're in the middle of a war, all bets are off. So this is the thing. Why has this hypothetical person gotten themselves into this predicament? They've gotten themselves into this predicament because they have been operating under a distorted worldview. Why are they operating under a distorted worldview? Because they have ingested information from, in this case, a media company called Sunglasses Media, which has deceptively relayed information to them that has distorted the facts of reality. And the facts of reality are, in the Middle East at the moment, there is turbulence between Iran, between Yemen, between Israel, between the United States of America. There is a simmering between these nations in the Middle East. And so if you were advising someone to go on a sunny break, on a sunny holiday to somewhere for a weekend, you would probably say, I'm not saying that you can never go to Iran, but going there right now would probably not be the best move on the chessboard because there's a simmering conflict bubbling under the surface here that could erupt at any moment, and you wouldn't want this conflict to erupt when you're out on your vacation to Iran. But of course, our hypothetical person has ingested the garbage information, the deceptive, manipulative information that has led to distortions in their worldview, and as a result, these distortions the distortion has led them to making an incorrect decision, to making a decision that isn't optimal for their life experience. And as a result, just like the Black Widow spider, if you're going down to the shoe because you have incorrectly identified the spider that's in your shoe, if you go down to your shoe, which has the spider web, and you think it's a false widow when it's actually a black widow, you may go down and say, it's okay, it's only a false widow. Look, we don't have to worry, folks. I'll just put it onto the palm of my hand. Oh gosh, it's bitten me. Oh dear. And then 1 minute later, you're sprawled out on the ground in a fit, or whatever happens whenever the toxic venom of a black widow courses through your body. In other words, you in that case have operated under the distorted belief that the spider in your shoe is a false widow, when in reality it's actually a black widow. And because you're operating under this distorted worldview, you have now made a decision that is not optimal for your existence. You've ended up going down to your shoe, picking up the black widow, thinking it's a false widow, it bites you, and now you're fucked. And so this is what can happen, folks, when you live under increasing distortion in your mind. And how can we clear distortion from our mind? We clear distortion with accurate, valuable, representative information that represents the facts of reality. That is how you clear distortion. You increase distortion by ingesting shitty, bogus, garbage information. So it works both ways. So as a result, do we want to be picking up black widow spiders in our hands? No, because there's a risk that if it bites you, you're going to be filled full of toxic venom. If we pick up a false widow spider, it may still bite you, but the venom isn't toxic. So there's no threat to your existence. And so as a result, in that case, we want to be able to identify the type of spider in our shoe. It's no different with information. You want to be able to identify, is this shitty, bogus information, or is it accurate, valuable information? Now the question is, how do we do this? So there's a two-step process to doing this. Here's the two-step process. It's actually quite straightforward. And actually, one of these steps, I am convinced, are going to be very familiar with it. Most people are familiar with the first step in this two-step process for dealing with the information age. And it's a two-step process that's actually very valuable for generally addressing information that comes our direction. So the first step in this process is quite straightforward. And it's very related to the BBC scandal. The first thing that you're going to want to do when you're trying to assess information, you're trying to assess, is it shitty, bogus information or valuable, accurate information? The first thing that you're going to want to do is to assess the source of the information. Let me repeat that. The first thing that you're going to want to do when you're trying to figure out if information is bogus and shitty or if information is accurate and reliable is to check the source of the information. You're going to want to run a background check on the source of the information and how accurate and reliable this source of information has been throughout its past history. Now let's relate this to the BBC and the recent scandal. So people tune into the BBC for accurate, up-to-date news. So when we have a scandal come out that says, oh, the BBC has deceptively edited this Donald Trump speech, a very deceptive edit in order to portray Donald Trump in a certain light. Now that this scandal has broken, and people can see the deceptively edited version of the speech and the representative original version of the speech, people are now looking at the source being the BBC. The source of this deceptively edited speech was the BBC. So people are now looking at the BBC as a source of information and saying, okay, well, they've been caught red-handed deceptively editing this Donald Trump speech. Have they been deceptively editing or presenting information for other news stories? And this is the thing. The first step, folks, the first step in dealing with information is to assess the credibility, to assess the reputation of the source of the information. If the source of the information has a lousy, shitty, deceptive track record, why the hell are you paying attention to their media? That is the question you must ask yourself. If you have done a diligent background check on the source of information that you are ingesting, and your research throws up the fact that this source of information, whether it's a person, a commentator, a media outlet, a YouTube channel, I don't care, whoever it is, if you do a background check on the source of information and your background check throws back in your direction that this source of information has a track record of lying, of being deceptive, of manipulating media and not telling the absolute truth. If you go down through that source of information and find out that they have that sort of a track record, then you should be immediately skeptical about anything that comes out of that source of information. Because if they have proved to you through their past history that they lie, that they are deceptive, that they manipulate the facts of reality, if you know that, then why would you, like an absolute dipstick, ingest their media and think that they have all of a sudden turned the corner and they are now telling the truth. Do not be a dipstick, because that is what a dipstick would do. A dipstick would look and go, yeah, that source of information has a bit of a dodgy track record. Yeah, they've been caught multiple times lying, being deceptive, manipulating the truth. Yeah, that is true. But I'm going to watch their content anyway and accept whatever it is they say as factually correct. If you do that, you are a dipstick and you deserve to live a life full of distortion, which is going to lead to a life full of shitty decision making, which is going to lead to a life that is full of lousiness. You will have a lousy existence if you run your background check on this source of information. You're going to have a lousy existence if you just continue to mindlessly ingest their media or to ingest their information when you know through your background check that they have a lousy track record of telling the truth and being honest. So this is pretty obvious, folks. If you get your information from certain sources, it goes without saying, step one, because we need to get our information from somewhere. So we can't just magically take information from thin air and put it into our minds. We have to get information from somewhere, whether it's a book, your parents, your teacher, your professor, your friends, or the online space. You're going to have to get information from somewhere. Somewhere. The information's going to have to come from somewhere. So you, as step one, you're always going to have to assess the credibility of any information from that source. You're going to have to inspect that source, run your own private investigation, look at their track record, look at their past history, look at the degree of honesty and truthfulness that comes out of this source, and try to figure out how much integrity this source of information has. And if it's tick, then we move on to step two. But if you are already faltering, if your source of information is already starting to flag, little red flags are starting to rise up from your source of information when you do a background check. If you're starting to see red flags, then you need to seriously sit down and have a discussion with yourself and say, why am I ingesting this content? Why am I ingesting this information? Because if I'm ingesting this information and accepting it to be in some way true, I could be literally injecting distortion into my own mind and my own worldview. And if you've already understood what I've said earlier, increasing distortion leads to increasing error in your decision making. And with increasing amounts of error being made in your decision making, that's going to lead to a lousy existence because you're going to make mistakes over and over and over again. You're going to lose opportunities over and over and over again because you're operating under too much distortion. Why are you operating under distortion? You are operating under distortion because wherever you are getting your information from has a shitty, lousy track record of being honest and telling the truth. That source of information is feeding you its information, you're ingesting it, the information is bogus, it's shitty, it's deceptive, it's manipulative, it's trying to get you to think about the world in a way that isn't representative of the facts of reality and what's happening. You are increasing the level of distortion in your mind and worldview, which is leading to shitty decision making, which is leading to your lousy existence. So the first thing we must do, number one, when it comes to the online sphere or the physical world, where you're assessing information in the physical world or in the online sphere, number one, and this is so obvious, folks, number one, we must investigate the source of information. We must investigate the track record that this source has with being honest, with telling the truth, and being accurate and reliable. If you are seeing red flags in the background check of this source of information, and you're starting to get evidence that they have been deceptive in the past multiple times, then you ought to be asking yourself the question, if I have figured out that this source of information has been repeatedly found out as being deceptive, in other words, this source of information has been found to be a liar on multiple occasions, then we must be honest and say, what is the probability that going forward, this source of information will continue to tell porky pies and be deceptive? And so we must look at that source of information with a very critical eye. Very critical eye. Okay, I think that's pretty straightforward though. And I think a lot of people, certainly in 2025, are aware of this. They are aware of the importance of fact-checking the credibility of your source of information. It's a pretty obvious point, but it needs to be said. That's step one. Now, step two. This is interesting. A lot of people understand and grasp the concept of step one, assessing the credibility of your source of information. Pretty obvious when you think about it. But step two is something that I see people make mistakes with all the time. And here's what step two is, folks. And a lot of people do not realize this when it comes to assessing information. Here's step two. Never outsource your thinking to anybody. Let me repeat that. Never outsource your thinking to anybody. What do I mean by that? Okay, so let's imagine you've done your background check on your source of information. And the background check comes back as all clear. Green flags. This source of information is credible, it has integrity, and it's normally accurate, and it essentially tries its best to provide reliable, accurate information where possible, and throughout its history, even if it has been wrong, it has had the humility to come out and say, yeah, I got that wrong. Going forward, we're going to make these changes to make sure that it never happens again. So let's say you've done step one. Step one being you've ran the background check on your source of information to see if the source of information is credible and has a good reputation with telling the truth and being honest in terms of relaying its information. So let's say you do that. Now, this is the mistake that I see people make. People, once they run the background check on this source of information, when people decipher and find out that the source of information has integrity and is reliable and is accurate, what people then do is they outsource their thinking to this source of information. In other words, what people do is they turn the off button in their mind and say, okay, I've found the credible source of information. Now I'm going to no longer engage my own brain. I'm just going to religiously ingest their content regardless of what it is that I think. I'm just going to continually ingest their content and take their word as gospel. In other words, they outsource their thinking. They no longer engage their own brain. Now, why is this a problem? This is a problem, folks, for the following reason. I'm going to give you an example of why it's a problem to stop at step one and not do step two. Remember, step one is assessing the credibility of your source of information by running a background check on how honest and truthful they have been in their past history. That's step one. Step two is never outsource your thinking to anybody. Let me tell you why it's very important that you don't stop at step one and that you move on to step two once you've got step one ticked, essentially. The reason why it's so important that you never outsource your thinking to anybody is for the following reason. I'm going to give you an example. Now, let's say we've got a guy called Depressed Adam. So here we have Depressed Adam. And the reason why Adam is depressed is because recently Adam got dumped by his girlfriend. So Adam's 22 years of age. Depressed Adam is 22 years of age. He's been recently dumped by his girlfriend. He's had a big argument with his best friend, and he's recently just got fired from his job. So let's imagine we have Depressed Adam. He is depressed because, number one, he's been dumped by his woman. Number two, he's had a big argument with his best friend, and this friendship is on the rocks. And then number three, he's just been fired from his job. So here we have Depressed Adam, 22 years of age, dumped with his best friend's friendship on the rocks, and unemployed. So Depressed Adam is quite rightfully depressed because Adam is getting feedback, negative feedback, that's causing him to be depressed. So he's got negative feedback from his environment. He's just been dumped. In other words, he hasn't qualified for his woman. His woman has dumped him and is looking to find a more high caliber male of some description. So Adam's been dumped, so he didn't qualify for his woman. That's depressing. Adam's had a big row with his best friend, so his friendship with him, because he's possibly just lost a big insurance policy in this friendship. And number three, Adam's just been fired. So he's lost his job. He's been fired because his boss has determined that he's not providing enough value to the business. And so the boss has said, sorry, Adam, you're out. You're not as valuable as we thought you were going to be. So we're going to let you go. So Adam has now got negative feedback from his employer that he's not particularly valuable in the workspace that he was working in. So you can see, Depressed Adam has had all these things. He's a 22-year-old young guy. He's had all these things happen to him in a very short space of time. Dumped by his woman, rocky friendship, and fired from his job. So Adam is quite rightfully depressed. He hasn't been struck by depression out of thin air. Depression hasn't just invaded his mind for no reason. He has got negative feedback from his environment, being dumped, row with his best friend, and getting fired. He's got negative feedback. And what happens when you get negative feedback? You get depressed. What is being depressed? Being depressed is a feeling. What is a feeling? A feeling is a feedback mechanism to get you to change your behavior. It would be a catastrophe if Adam wasn't depressed. Because if Adam didn't get depressed, then he wouldn't know that his current strategy for life isn't working. Depression is a natural process. It's supposed to happen when you get negative feedback. The depression is a feeling which is signaling to depressed Adam, Adam, your strategy for life is not working. You've just been dumped. You've had a rocky period with your best friend. You've just got fired. Whatever it is you're doing, Adam, is not working. You're getting negative feedback. So I'm going to generate this feeling of depression to let you know that whatever your life strategy is currently, it ain't working, son. So depressed Adam's depression is completely natural. It's supposed to happen. It's a natural mechanism within the human mind. Normal and natural. Nothing unusual. He's got negative feedback. And so this depressed feeling essentially is birthed in his mind to try and tell Adam that what you're doing is not working. You need to change your life's strategy. In other words, you need to change your behavior. The depression acts as the ignition to change behavior. Because if depressed Adam got all of this negative feedback but didn't feel depressed, then what would happen? Adam would continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. The depression is the signal to Adam that what he is doing is not working. So the depressed feeling is normal and natural. Why am I saying this in this example? Because let's say Adam's mother, conscientious Susie. Let's call depressed Adam's mother conscientious Susie. And let's imagine depressed Adam has a fabulous relationship with conscientious Susie, his mother. Let's say throughout depressed Adam's 22 years of existence, conscientious Susie, his mother, has acted as a really reliable source of information. Let's imagine conscientious Susie has been essentially fully vetted by depressed Adam. Depressed Adam fully trusts conscientious Susie because throughout conscientious Susie's past history, she has been able to give accurate, reliable information to depressed Adam. And depressed Adam really values conscientious Susie, his mother. Okay, so conscientious Susie has an impeccable track record with depressed Adam. Depressed Adam really values his mother's feedback. And she has demonstrated to depressed Adam throughout his life that she is a source of information with integrity. She wants the best for her son. So let's imagine in this circumstance, conscientious Susie sees that her son, depressed Adam, is very depressed. He's down in the dumps. But let's imagine conscientious Susie doesn't fully understand the process of depression. Let's imagine conscientious Susie, depressed Adam's mother, buys into the narrative that depression is like this random cloud that just appears over people and injects depression into their mind for no reason. Let's imagine conscientious Susie thinks that that is how depression works. She thinks that it's just this random disease that just randomly affects people for no reason. And let's imagine conscientious Susie thinks that the solution to her son, depressed Adam's predicament, is to go to the psychiatrist and get psychiatric drugs. Let's imagine conscientious Susie thinks that that is the best play on the chessboard for her son, depressed Adam. Now, because depressed Adam is now outsourcing his thinking to his credible source of information, which is his mother, conscientious Susie, depressed Adam has stopped at step one. He basically looks at his mother, conscientious Susie, and says, look, you have been a very reliable, accurate source of information for me throughout my entire existence, and you've got tremendous integrity, and I respect you enormously as a figure and a source of information. So in this moment of need, I, depressed Adam, I am going to outsource my thinking to my mother because she has proved to have an excellent track record of being reliable and accurate and looking out for me and wanting the best for me. So I'm going to outsource my thinking. I'm going to outsource this problem to my mother because she has an excellent track record. What's going to happen here? Well, what's going to happen is conscientious Susie is going to say, with the best intentions, with the best information that she has at her disposal, she is going to say to depressed Adam, son, I think you need to go to Dr. Schmo. Dr. Schmo, the psychiatrist. You're going to have to go to him and you're going to have to get some prescription psychiatric drugs off him because, you know what, Adam? Whenever you get struck by the cloud of depression, this is what you need to do. You need to go to the shrink and you need to get psychiatric drugs to get rid of this depression disease. Now, because depressed Adam is outsourcing his thinking, in this case to his mother, conscientious Susie. And because depressed Adam really values depressed or conscientious Susie as a source of information, he has ran the background check. He has got evidence that conscientious Susie, his mother, is a very reliable and accurate source of information. But because depressed Adam is outsourcing his thinking to what he believes to be a credible source of information, he has now made a mistake. And the mistake that he has made is he is actually not thinking himself. He has absolved himself of thinking. Instead, all he is doing is seeing the credible source of information and wanting that source of information to take on his problem and figure out the solution for him. In other words, he has outsourced his thinking. And now what's going to happen to depressed Adam? The real solution to depressed Adam's problem is understanding the mechanics of his mind. The real solution is understanding that depression is not this mysterious cloud that just hovers over random people for a random reason and injects depression into their mind. It would be far more beneficial for depressed Adam to realise that depression is nothing other than a natural feeling that arises whenever someone is facing negative feedback. In this case, depressed Adam has got dumped by his woman. He's had a rocky, turbulent relationship with his best friend in recent months, and he's just been fired from his job. In other words, negative feedback is flooding depressed Adam's mind. And as a result, the natural thing that the human mind will do is the human mind will acknowledge, in this case, that depressed Adam is receiving negative feedback. In other words, his life strategy is not working. So what the body will do, what the mind will do, is it will conjure a feeling of depression. This feeling is a signaling device in order to tell depressed Adam that your current strategy for life is not working and you need to change your behavior and change your strategy. That is the solution to depressed Adam's problem, not psychiatric medication. Psychiatric medication, what is that going to do? It's not going to address the root cause of the depression. All it's going to do is it's going to, one could argue, actually get depressed Adam into a vicious cycle whereby he is now hooked on drugs that aren't actually getting to the root of the problem, which just leave him perpetually in this vicious cycle of being depressed eternally. Because, of course, when we start bringing in drugs into the equation, these psychoactive substances that are going to alter the brain chemistry, this can end up putting depressed Adam into an even more vicious cycle of depression without actually addressing the root cause of why he was depressed in the first place, which was because he was getting negative feedback from his environment, which was conjuring up a feeling of depression, which is trying to get depressed Adam to change his behavior and his life's strategy. And this is an example of why, folks, we do not want to outsource our thinking. Even if the background check of our source of information comes back as clean, we never want to outsource our thinking, because depressed Adam outsourced his thinking in this example to conscientious Susie. And conscientious Susie, despite being a reliable, accurate source of information throughout depressed Adam's life, in this case, conscientious Susie has actually got the wrong information. Now, she isn't maliciously and deceptively undermining her son's life existence. She's not maliciously trying to sabotage him. All that's happened is she has got information about how she thinks depression works. And she is then relaying that information to depressed Adam, her son. And because depressed Adam has outsourced his thinking and isn't thinking for himself, or isn't consulting other sources of information, he accepts conscientious Susie's advice, he heads off to the psychiatrist, gets psychiatric medication, and now he's hooked on drugs without having actually addressed the root cause of the depression in the first place. And so this is the critical step number 2, folks. When you assess the credibility of your source of information, you do not want to stop there. Because guess what, folks? No matter how credible your source of information is, no matter how outstanding the reputation is of that source of information, they could still be wrong. Now, they may be wrong in an admirable sense. They may not be wrong deliberately. They're not trying to be wrong to undermine your own existence. But nevertheless, they could be wrong nonetheless. They could have acquired your source of information that has been credible, could have, in this instance, acquired the wrong information. And because you blindly trust this source of information by outsourcing your thinking, you blindly take on, without actually thinking about what the source is saying, you blindly take their advice, you blindly take their information, you integrate it into your life's existence without actually critically analysing it, and then you actually don't know if the information is objectively correct or not. And this is why step number 2 is so important. Step number 2 means you never outsource your information. And the reason why I say this is because I see this all the time online. Influencers, these people who have big social media followings. You literally have followers of these people who will wait by their phone for a notification of their live stream or whatever the hell it is for their new upload. They will literally wait for that person to inform their own thinking without having even thought of the problem themselves. You literally have these influencers online, and these influencers have followers who will literally, to the letter of the law, follow blindly the information that comes from these influencers. And the followers never actually stop for a moment and say, actually, let me think about this myself. Let me actually engage my own brain and think about what it is that this person is saying. Yes, this person has a very credible track record. Yes, this person appears to have integrity. Yes, I have ran the background check, and it appears like we have a load of green flags. But let me actually just pause for a second. Let me come to my own conclusion first about the piece of information before I just blindly accept what it is that this person is actually telling me. Let me at least try to think through critically what it is that they're saying. Because you know what actually happens, folks, when you do this? When you actually try to critically sit down and analyze a piece of information independent of the source and how credible or not they are. When you sit down and try to come to your own conclusion first, this can be a very good exercise to start getting into the habit of doing. Because sometimes what can happen is your credible source of information can sometimes get it wrong. Sometimes they can get it wrong. And so it's good to not just blindly accept what it is that your credible source of information is saying. Because just like depressed Adam and conscientious Susie, depressed Adam really values conscientious Susie's feedback. But because he is refusing, because depressed Adam is refusing to literally engage his own critical thinking, he's refusing to think for himself. He's refusing to, in this case, literally try and find a solution to the problem within his own mind. He's refusing to even try to do that. He is literally just outsourcing the problem to conscientious Susie. You can see the problem here, folks. You can see the problem that even if the source of information is credible and the background check comes back with green flags, that doesn't mean that that source of information is always correct. And so, this is why step number 2 is so important. You never outsource your thinking. You can cross-reference your thinking with another source of information. That's different. There's a difference between outsourcing your thinking completely and cross-referencing your own thinking. That is a very good idea. So the point here is, folks, what you want to do is you want to think about the information first. You yourself, you want to run a critical analysis of the information. And then, when you have ran your own independent analysis of the information from your credible source, because you will have followed step one. Step one is still important, folks. You want to have a whole bunch of credible sources of information on the table here to select from. So it goes without saying, step one is critical. You must do step one first. Assess the credibility of the source of information and what their track record is like. But once you have a whole bunch of credible sources of information on the table, what you then don't want to do is outsource your thinking completely to these sources of information. Because guess what, folks? These sources of information are also not 100% infallible. They can also make mistakes. Humans can make mistakes, and AI can also make mistakes. So don't think by typing information into an AI chatbot that you're going to get away with this either. AI also makes mistakes. Humans make mistakes, AI makes mistakes. So it doesn't matter whether your source of information is human or if it's AI. What you want to do first, once you've assessed, of course, the credibility of the source, and you have all of these credible sources of information on the table, what you then want to do is you want to first come to your own conclusion. Come to your own conclusion first. Don't immediately jump to outsourcing your thinking. Come to your own conclusion first, and then cross-reference your thinking with your now credible sources of information on the table. That is the way we want to deal with the online sphere. That is how we want to deal with the information age. Not outsourcing our thinking, but cross-referencing our own independent analysis that has taken place in our own mind first. Instead of looking towards influencers or media outlets or commentators like they're some fucking messiah. They're not a messiah. They are people or AI-generated machines that have information. And yes, some are going to be more credible than others. That's step one. You find the credible ones. You find these credible sources. But step two, folks, don't be seduced by the credible source, because any source of information is never going to be 100% correct. There are always going to be errors, even among credible sources. And so what you want to do first, to try and reduce the probability of succumbing to an error in your thinking. It isn't always possible. We all exist with some degree of distortion in our minds and in our worldview. You cannot eliminate distortion, but you can reduce it. And if you follow these two steps, you are doing a really good job, I would argue, of reducing the amount of distortion. And so that is the key thing, folks. Do not outsource your thinking. Run your own independent analysis of a situation. Run the analysis first, come to your own conclusion, and then, using your carefully selected credible sources that are now on the table, you then cross-reference your own thinking with those sources, and then that's going to give you the best chance of honing in on the most accurate, reliable, and useful information that is best going to represent reality, and it's going to increase your probability of avoiding shitty, bogus, nonsense, deceptive, manipulative information that comes from other sources. Okay, so that is the two-step process. And how long have we been going for? 1 hour and 36 minutes. The Bandito has been rambling. But I think this is good, folks, because we live in the information age and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What do I mean by that? You don't want to just throw your hands up and say, oh, there's too much information and I just don't want to deal with all the information. If you want to do that, that's fine. But remember, folks, information is critical. whether you like it or not. We need to get information from somewhere. And so you then have the decision to make. Do I just opt out of the game and live an existence where I'm locked up in my house, interacting with zero people or media outlets or sources of information in the online sphere? If you want to just opt out and literally live in your fucking room all your life, fine. But then we could question the quality of that life existence. It goes without saying. If you're going to accept the fact that we live in the information age, then what you ought to start thinking is, how can I tease apart the shitty, bogus information from the accurate, valuable information that actually represents reality accurately? And this is where I think the two-step process that we've talked about at length here comes into the equation. The first thing you do is you find the credible source of information. How do you do that? Very simple. You run a background check on the source of information. You look at that source of information and look at its past history. We have the history of that source of information to tell us about how accurate, honest, truthful, and reliable they are. Run a background check and see how many red flags or green flags come up in that background check. If it turns out that that source of information is credible and they have an excellent track record of telling the truth, being honest, being humble when they make mistakes, correcting and updating their information, then great. We put that source of information on the table as a potential useful source for valuable information. But we do not stop there. We don't just stop at finding the credible source of information, because what we don't want to do is outsource our thinking. That's a mistake. What we want to do is we want to get a whole bunch of credible sources of information on the table, and then what we want to do is we want to come to our own conclusions first. We want to run an independent analysis in our own mind with our pre-existing information that we have. Run an independent analysis, and then once we've came to our own conclusions about a particular subject or topic, then we cross-reference our own thinking with our carefully selected, credible sources of information. Okay. Enough rambling from the bandito. Let's have a wee check in the live chat. So we'll go into the live chat. Let me just see if I've been functioning just fine here. I hope the stream has actually recorded properly. Of course, we had the gremlins at the start. So let's see if things are still working. It seems that things are still working. So let's proceed to the live chats and let's see if anybody has been engaging with the show. Of course, there's always the possibility that there's nobody in the live chat. There's always the possibility, but let's check and see if we've got any people in the live chat. All right. So I'm heading over to the live chat, and it turns out that there's nobody in the live chat. Such is life. We have ran a little bit over time tonight. We are, of course, actually, what time is it? 9:30. So we are well over time because, of course, we were an hour late. So there's nobody in the chat. We just have Quized's original comment about getting the gremlin out of the stream. So anyway, we will call it quits there, folks. I hope that has been a useful little dive into our information age. We are 60 minutes late. We should have been streaming earlier, but we did defeat the gremlin. We defeated the gremlin. We were persistent, and we got there in the end. So, before we wrap up tonight's show, again, if you enjoyed the live stream, feel free to give it a thumbs up. Feel free to give it a like. If you are watching this live stream after the event has been posted, then feel free to get down into the comments section. Let me know what you thought about tonight's show. I'd be curious to know. And then finally, as I said in our little introduction, if you like what we are doing here at Bandito Talks, if you think there is value in this particular source of information, maybe you're listening to this source of information and thinking, what a load of bogus, what a load of bollocks. Maybe you're thinking, you know what? The Bandito might be proving himself as a semi-reliable or accurate source of information. Maybe you think it's bogus. Maybe you think it's accurate. If you think we are providing value here at Bandito Talks, if there's something useful to be learned, then feel free to become a subscriber to the channel. And you can get notified on all of our live streams and all of our uploads. And so with that, folks, that is a wrap for tonight. Good show. I enjoyed that. I'm glad that we actually persisted, despite the gremlin, which was defeated. We will be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. We will be back at 7 p.m., not 8 p.m., 7 p.m. Irish time, all being well. We will be back with some news on the tube. Should be a good show. News on the Tube's always a good show. Random news stories where we're going to try and extract the lessons from them. So feel free to join us here tomorrow night, 7 p.m, here on YouTube for some news on the Tube. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show, folks, and all being well, I shall get chatting with you all tomorrow evening, 7 p.m, here on YouTube, Irish time. That is over and out from the Bandito.